My name is Catherine Brooks. I'm in the School of Information here at University of Arizona. I'm the Associate Director for the school, and I also direct the Center for Digital Society and Data Studies, where we're working on a lot of different topics that are sort of big challenges of the day. And one of our biggest challenges, as we've all been watching the news, revolve around issues of data privacy, data management, and issues of surveillance. In fact, just this morning I was reading an article where apparently now it's an issue of national security. I guess the Fitbit problem is continuing and turning into an issue of national concern. In any event, we have a lot to talk about today, and I don't want to take a lot of time away from the panelists, and certainly at the end we want to open it up for questions. Briefly, you know there's a new School of Information in town. We're the only iSchool in Arizona, and we're studying a lot of different topics. iSchools are typically, the heart of any good iSchool is a really solid library program, and I know we have some librarians in the crowd. In addition, we're studying issues of information technology, information processing, information policy and ethics, as well as communication and information behavior. So we're just doing a lot of things in the iSchool. And within the iSchool is where the Center for Digital Society and Data Studies is housed. And I want to just get back to the libraries just for a minute. I noticed on our RSVP list we had a number of people coming in from the library. And it is a reminder that over the years, the people that were really teaching internet safety 20 years ago were the librarians. And Brian Heidorn is our director. He was recently at a conference, and they were talking about managing large amounts of astronomy data. And I guess it was an astronomer who said, where would we find a place where people know how to manage data and protect it? And so, of course, Brian was thinking the libraries, but the astronomers weren't quick to think about the role of the library today. And so it's a big job. And so thank you, librarians in the room, for protecting users, managing data, and so on. We have a couple of goals today, and if you're on Twitter, feel free to tweet. There is an International Privacy Day, which was actually yesterday, and so our first goal is to make sure that the University of Arizona is recognized for caring a lot about data privacy and issues of surveillance, and so feel free to that. They're using hashtag #PrivacyAware. I'm not a big Twitter person, but if you're tweeting, and I can also mention that some of our panelists are on the phones, not messing around. It was kind of a joke earlier that I'm not playing on my phone, I'm tweeting. But anyway, please do tweet. And so the University of Arizona is recognized as a site for researching these topics and putting energy into this area. Our second goal is to just recognize among us in the room and also across panelists who's doing what kind of research so that we know what each other's doing and we can work together down the road when we're trying to address related scholarly topics and problems. The advertising for this event, I know, had long bios for each speaker and also our moderator, David Seedy, down there at the end. So I don't want to read those. Those are really long and that would take a lot of time, but I can just generally welcome the panelists. I can say that Derek Bambauer is unfortunately very ill this morning, and so we appreciate him not coming in case it's the deadly flu. David Seedy is our moderator. He's a School of Information doctoral student, but he might be the most committed privacy advocate I have ever met. And so if I attribute this event to one person, it would be David Seedy, who would walk into my office about every week to say, what are we doing for Privacy Day? And so thank you for that, David. And we'll turn to him in a minute. There's a fancy way to ask questions as we go, also with your mobile phone, and so he's going to explain that in just a second, if that works. If it doesn't work, we can also do standard Q&A at the end because you will have questions for our panelists. Working from David this way, we have Laura Brand-Marte. She's a professor in Management Information Systems in Eller, and she's really a point person too all over campus for issues of privacy. So she's good to know and good to have here today. She's also a good Twitter person, so I think that's what she's doing now, and we really appreciate that. So thank you. Mark Verstraete is a postdoctoral scholar working with Derek Bambauer in the College of Law, but really a nice long history of focusing on privacy issues. And so thank you for coming over, Mark. Oscar Gandy, we found him here in Tucson. He's a professor. And what a wonderful thing to do and bring Oscar in, and thank you for coming in from off campus. He's Professor Emeritus from the University of Pennsylvania in communication. He brings a political economy perspective to the study of privacy and surveillance and issues of information policy and influencing governmental policy, and so thank you so much for coming. And finally, last but not least, is Kay Mattison, also in the School of Information, and she brings a philosophical perspective to the study of privacy and surveillance, and so thank you. Also glad to have you here.
So I'm really happy to be able to be here and talk and think a little bit more about privacy. And what I want to do is actually, as a philosopher, talk about the metaphors we use for privacy. In particular, I want to suggest a new metaphor that I think is more appropriate for our age of machine learning and big data. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to do a dramatic reading, and then I'm going to make 3 points about what I have done my dramatic reading about. So you may all be familiar with the metaphor of the panopticon. And that's often used as a metaphor for a surveillance society where people have no privacy. So Jeremy Bentham came up with this idea. It was a period when large institutions were growing, such as prisons. And he thought, well, this came up with a solution for how to manage prisoners. And the idea was an architectural idea. And that would be that you have a prison, it's sort of circular, and you have all the cells, and there you can see into the cells from the center. And in the center is a tower that can look down at any of the cells and see what the prisoners are doing at any time. The prisoners, however, cannot see who is in the tower and can't see who is looking at them or when. Bentham thought this was a great solution to the problem of controlling the prisoners because they would all know that at any time they could be being watched. They wouldn't know when they were being watched, but it might be at any time, so they would behave themselves because they would internalize this idea, oh, I gotta be careful because I'm always being watched. And the term panopticon, panopticization, Michel Foucault talked about the panopticon as well as this metaphor of control. And it most certainly fits with this idea of surveillance as a big issue in privacy. But I want to suggest a new metaphor. I think panopticon's great. I think we still need to think about that problem with surveillance and being observed and the issues around that. But I think it has its limitations, and if we are always thinking about the panopticon as our metaphor, we're going to miss some really important things. And in particular, what I want us to do is change from thinking about how our privacy is invaded. You know, it's not about how others know about us. The panopticon is how, right? Here's one way people could know something about us. They could be surveilling us. What I want to say is what privacy is, we should be thinking about is what people know about us, not how they know it. So to illustrate this, I'd like to do a little dramatic reading. There we go. All right, I got my script. But I also need my costume. So this is going to be about a very famous individual. So this is my suggestion for the new metaphor for invasions of privacy. All right, so this starts with 2 strangers being introduced by a mutual friend of both. This is an old friend of mine, John Watson. Afghanistan or Iraq? Which was it? Afghanistan or Iraq? Afghanistan. Got my eye on a nice little place in central London. We ought to be able to afford it. We'll meet there tomorrow, 7 o'clock. We've only just met and we're going to go look at a flat. Problem? We don't know a thing about each other. I don't know where we're meeting. I don't even know your name. I know you're an army doctor, and you've been invalided from home from Afghanistan. You've got a brother worried about you. But you won't go to him for help because you don't approve of him. Possibly because he's an alcoholic, more likely because he recently walked out on his wife. And I know your therapist thinks your limp is psychosomatic, quite correctly, I'm afraid. That's enough to be going on with, don't you think? The name's Sherlock Holmes, and the address is 221B Baker Street. So how does Sherlock know all this about Watson? Your first assumption might be, if you didn't know Sherlock, that he must have been spying on him. He must have been engaging in surveillance activities to know all these personal, private details. He must have been following him to his therapist's office and listening in on the conversations. He must have investigated his family life and talked to his brother. Well, later Sherlock explains that he's not done anything like that, right? When they meet at the flat, there's the great reveal. How does Sherlock know this? So here they are meeting at the flat. Watson begins. When I met you for the first time yesterday, you said Afghanistan or Iraq. You look surprised. Yes, how did you know? I didn't know. I saw. Your haircut, the way you hold yourself says military. When you came to Bart's Hospital, you said, bit different from my day, so you were trained there. So army doctor, obvious. Your face is tanned, but no tan above the wrists. You've been abroad, but not sunbathing. Your limp's bad when you walk, but you don't ask for a chair when you stand. Like you've forgotten about it. So at least it's partly psychosomatic. That says the original circumstances of the injury were traumatic. Wounded in action then. Wounded in action, suntan, either Afghanistan or Iraq. You said I had a therapist. You've got a psychosomatic limp. Of course you've got a therapist. Then there's your brother. Your phone. It's expensive. Email enabled. MP3 player. You're looking to share a flat. You wouldn't buy this. It's a gift. Scratches, not one, many over time. It's been in the same pocket as keys and coins. You wouldn't treat your one luxury item like this, so it had a previous owner. Next bit's easy. You know it already. The engraving says Harry Watson. Clearly a family member who's given you this old phone. Not your father, this is a young man's gadget. So brother it is. Now who's Clara? 3 Kisses says it's a romantic attachment. The expense of the phone says wife, not girlfriend. Must have given it to him recently. The model's only 6 months old. Marriage in trouble then. 6 months and he's given it away. If she'd left him, he would have kept it. Sentiment. No, he wanted rid of it. He left her. He gave the phone to you, so he wants you to stay in touch. You're looking for cheap accommodation, but not going to your brother for help. That says you've got a problem with him. Maybe you liked his wife, or didn't like his drinking. How can you possibly know about the drinking? Shot in the dark. Good one, though. Power connection, tiny little scuff marks around the edge. Every night he plugs it in to charge, but his hands are shaking. Never seen those marks on a sober man's phone. Never seen a drunk's without them. Watson, that was amazing. That's not what people normally say. What do people normally say? Piss off! And that's what we would probably say if someone who didn't know, we've never shared any information like this with, came along and told us all this information about ourselves. So I want to make 3 points about this new metaphor for privacy invasion. First, notice that Holmes' knowledge of Watson's personal life required absolutely no surveillance of Watson. Well, I need to hurry up. Absolutely no surveillance of Watson, right? He didn't follow him, he didn't spy in his house, he didn't have cameras or any of that. All he did was see Watson in a public place with Watson saying very benign things and saw his phone. That's all he needed. So here's surveillance, there's just what I would call an invasion of privacy with no surveillance of the person. Secondly, notice that Watson could not protect his privacy by not sharing the information. Right? So he had no control over what Holmes knew about him. He couldn't choose to not use Twitter. Right? So one example that I want to make the analogy with is take the example of Twitter and how people are using Twitter data these days. So recently there was a talk just the other day for the cognitive science department, someone who's doing big data and who is analyzing tweets using people who have admitted or outed themselves as schizophrenics, then analyzing the language they use to then be able to infer from language that is used to whether someone's a schizophrenic. So the idea is that now in future, we'll be able to partly get some evidence, partial diagnosis of someone with schizophrenia based on the language they use. Notice, it doesn't matter if you're a person who never uses Twitter, never outs yourself as a schizophrenic, or never uses Twitter. The information there is gathered so that they can then make an inference about you. Just like Sherlock, how does he do this? He's incredibly brilliant. He observes everything, he remembers everything, and he makes great inferences. He's just like big data and analysis, right? But he's an ordinary person. So basically, we're going from a world where we could just assume that other people can't infer all this information about us, to a world where they can. It's a world now, more and more, where everyone is Sherlock Holmes. So the very sense of what it means for something to be private as opposed to public is starting to break down, because what you are just maybe saying in a letter can now be used to infer your psychological diagnosis. And the final point I want to make is illustrated by a final exchange between Holmes and Watson. Well, Holmes says, "Did I get anything wrong?" Watson, Harry is short for Harriet. Harry's your sister. Sister. There's always something. So what's nice about, I think, the new Sherlock Holmes, which this is from, is that it recognizes that Sherlock is not perfect. He makes bad inferences sometimes. So that's the other thing to realize, is that it's not just about people knowing things about you. It's people thinking that they know things about you based on evidence and inference. And so there's also this secondary problem of when it's not the problem that they know through surveillance, it's the problem that they think they know when they really don't know. And so I hope that in future we can not just have a panopticon metaphor, but also the Sherlock Holmes metaphor when we think about privacy and the dangers of privacy invasions. Thanks.
I'm supposed to provide you with this sense of who I am and the kind of work that I do, or the kind of work that I've done in the past. The best way to do that, I think, is to tell you something about the books that I have published over the years. My first book was Beyond Agenda Setting, Information Subsidies and Public Policy. It reflects my tendency to go against the grain. Most research done at that time was about media's influence on the public agenda. My focus was on the sources of the news. You know, public relation firms, special events, commissioned white papers, congressional testimony. I'd suggest that all of those government information officers that Governor Ducey has been adding to his staff would be a prime example of the kinds of providers of information subsidies that I'm making reference to. My next book was The Panoptic Sort, A Political Economy of Personal Information. This book is best known for privacy and surveillance, but again, my focus is a little bit different from what was the norm at that time. I focused on corporate rather than governmental collection and use of personal information. Third book is not all that popular. It didn't make it into this great university's great library. That was called Communication and Race, a Structural Perspective. It was about the production and the distribution and the consumption of media commodities, including audiences, especially those defined by race and class. After generating those books and a host of articles, I achieved emeritus status. That means I escaped the demands of the classroom far earlier than most colleagues of my age. And I moved to Tucson in 2006 to enjoy my version of a retirement. That involved working on my latest book, the one that relates most closely to the work being done here with regard to data studies. That book was called Coming to Terms with Chance. I heard all of you all make reference to colons. I'm colonified. They're everywhere. Coming to Terms with Chance, Engaging Rational Discrimination and Cumulative Disadvantage. As the subtitle suggests, concerned about discriminatory uses of data for classification, prediction, and production of actionable intelligence for use by institutional actors. Was also concerned about the ways in which those uses contributed to what many of us call and understand as cumulative disadvantage, or the Matthew effect, where the rich get richer. Without the requirement of preparing lectures and grading papers, I increased my engagement with community organizations. Among the ones that mattered most, there was a group called the Sourdough Starters, through which we sponsored a democracy school. And then we brought guest speakers. And we even tried to get the city to understand that corporations were not the people, and that money was not speech. Then there was Sustainable Tucson, which continues to help the community to understand the meaning and importance of making individual and collective choices about how we affect the environment. I have another page here. I have several. That was followed by a bit of dalliance with city planning through my work with Imagine Greater Tucson, followed by my current involvement as a member of the board of Tucson Residents for Responsive Government, TRIG, if you will. My association with the Academy, on the other hand, has been limited to what I call old guy lectures. I was pleased and fortunate to be invited to give a number of lectures and to participate in workshops. This was primarily on the basis of the work that I did before my retirement, although the privacy and surveillance folk seem to understand and appreciate the way that my last book brought privacy and surveillance and discrimination and inequality together as a public policy concern. The old guy's keynote speech that I gave to the Surveillance Studies Network conference in Barcelona in 2016 provided a really special benefit, in that I developed a rather fine working relationship with a young scholar who was kind enough to come up and introduce herself. Obviously, her name Selena Namorn and I had common interest in surveillance, but she introduced me to the work that she was doing with regard to neural marketing. I mean, something about which I had absolutely no idea. We wrote a paper, and after several go-rounds with our reviewers, we managed to publish an article last year in International Journal of Communication on neural marketing and remote sensing. You might take a look at that piece, because the way we attempt to characterize big data analysis related to cognitive style as a technology based on remote sensing that involves a great number of moral and ethical questions that we need to address. Next, we developed a truly massive paper. I looked at the legal colleague and said, I know, for lawyers, 75 pages is nothing, but for communication scholars, 75 pages are a very massive paper. That one's about that size, and that's single-spaced. All right. We've sent off the first set of papers for review. We have another one already in the work. Part of the focus of these papers has a particular relevance to the discussions I hope we have here this morning. It has a focus on a smart city as the primary site for the implementation of attempts to engage with that so-called thing called behavioral market failures that Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler suggested we can correct with carefully designed nudges based on a manipulation of default options, which we're going to encounter everywhere we turn. And now, today, I'm here at the University of Arizona, where one of the characteristic public-private partnerships that will define our smart city governance has already been established. This P3 relationship that will come to play a central role in making choices about the kinds of transaction-generated information, TGI, that'll be captured, subject to analysis by data scientists, and then implemented in some program related to healthcare, or transportation, or criminal justice, or the quality of life more generally. The work of this collective has been incorporated in a proposal that was made to the U.S. Department of Transportation. The so-called Smart City team here at the university generated a proposal for a $50 million grant to develop solutions to transportation-related problems in Tucson and the region. The University of Arizona was a primary partner in that effort. Amongst the 4 primary categories they promised to address, there were 2 that I think deal directly with our concerns for this morning's discussion. The first being a city engagement campaign, understood as marketing or outreach, if you wish. The second was the development of a transportation data management portal. What could that possibly mean? I was particularly concerned about the way this project was going to make use of what some people refer to as open source intelligence by engaging in social media data mining to gather information about users and the nature and extent of their satisfaction or not with the public transit system. The proposal's section on data collection and use identified a great many new sources and forms of data that would be gathered, and it described some of the partnerships that might be involved in the data management and exploitation activity that we might see developed. The proposal was not fun, but I doubt that the interest or the collaborative infrastructure is going to go away. While the proposal did reveal some sensitivity with regard to concerns about privacy, it would be important to understand the extent to which this and future projects understand that a focus on the privacy of individuals is quite limited with what some of us are trying to engage as group privacy. Concerns about group privacy are related to the harms that people are subjected to as a result of their being assigned to algorithmically defined groups, rather than one of those groups whose members enjoy special protective status because of the race or gender or perhaps the age of those group members. This group membership is an important issue, one that Professor Thiessen has raised with regard to the need for collective subjects to have an awareness and an intention in order to form a socially or politically active group. I mean, people who are assigned to groups by algorithms have no basis for knowledge about the existence of those groups and no way to imagine what it is that others are thinking about those same kinds of problems that they are confronting. So I'm wondering, what kind of progress can we make in getting the public and the legal system to develop a way of defining and responding to the status of these groups, which are not really collectives, as we understand other kinds of effective political agents or actors. We might want to consider then what the likes of us and others within the public sphere might facilitate the development of collective consciousness by the many who would like to be victims of surveillance capitalism. This is part of what's being developed as a framework for integrating social justice concerns with what's been primarily a technological response to the design and the management of communication infrastructures. Some of us hope that these infrastructures that are going to be designed by the engineers would limit surveillance and its negative consequences for these ordinary folk in their communities of interest. We're going to have to wait, of course, in order to see how successful the folks are within the European Union are in getting those entities and organizations that are using deep learning AI systems to explain, that's a responsibility they're supposed to face, how they came to their assessments and decisions regarding the deservingness for some benefit or opportunity. I don't want to go off the text too far, but the idea that people are going to have to take a test now in Kentucky, right? If they're not employed, in order to get health care, right, to be able to pass an exam in order to get health care, strikes me as going way too far in that direction. The best we might hope for then might be some kind of a quarterly report of the categories and scores that are being used by corporate actors and government agencies to identify these potential collectives. That's what I'm hoping for, at least as a start. Thanks.